Okay, welcome everyone for another lecture. Today what I want to do is move on from the general idea of how we find solutions to biodiversity decline. So for that we talked about protected areas, we talked about off-reserve conservation, we talked about threatened species, we talked about restoration. Now we're going to get into a couple of case studies for the next two lectures. So I want to do that today, and what I'll do today is actually talk about a case study from quite a while ago, but I think it's still relevant today, unfortunately, one might say, of showing you work that I did together with some colleagues in Australia quite a few years ago by now. But I think, as I said, I think it's still relevant today, and that's why it's perhaps a good case study. And that case study is about livestock grazing in southeastern Australia and what it means for trees and what that means for biodiversity. So that's what we're going to do today, talk about that particular case study. Let's see if I can get the technology to work. Excellent. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about grazing and define what woodlands are. I'll talk then about trees, animals, and farmers. So for trees, I'll talk about tree regeneration, what tree regeneration is all about in southeastern Australia, how grazing is influencing it. I'll talk about animals, and by that I mean wild animals, what will happen to wildlife if trees don't regenerate. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about farmers. What do farmers think about ongoing patterns of tree decline in southeastern Australia? Livestock grazing is a fascinating thing because globally, essentially no other land use, human land use, takes up more space than livestock grazing. And the demand for agricultural goods is projected to more than double between 2000 and 2050. So this influences both arable land, but also livestock grazing is a major land use around the world. If we take a look at a continent like Australia, then we see that almost the entire continent is grazed commercially to some extent. Some parts have a lot of commercial grazing, and some parts have a little bit less commercial grazing. When we take a look at a map in Australia of commercial grazing zones and a map of woodlands, then we find a map of woodlands over here and a map of so-called grassy woodlands here, and a map of grazing zones here. Then we find that there's basically a close correspondence between this particular, it's called the southern, the southern high rainfall zone, or southern temperate zone rather, southern temperate zone here. We have a close correspondence between this here and this part of temperate grassy woodlands. And that's where we're going to be focusing today. Temperate woodlands are internationally recognized as a threatened ecoregion. We looked at that in one of the earliest lectures, that land clearing globally has been very much biased towards the sort of land that can be used well for agriculture. So temperate woodlands fall into a kind of climate typically that is also very suitable for agriculture, and so they have been disproportionately cleared globally. One conceptual model that we also looked at in one of the earlier classes, and one of the earliest ones when I talked about landscape change, is that we tend to have landscapes being simplified from more or less intact in terms of their native vegetation to variegated, fragmented, and ultimately relictual, in the sense that we have less and less of the original vegetation cover retained. Here it says habitat. I would not use habitat, but vegetation cover. But we have less of the original vegetation cover retained. We have increasing distances, so loss of connectivity between these patches. We have increasing edge effects in the landscape, and we have these different patterns of shrinkage of patches and also attrition of patches, meaning some patches through time are being lost. When we take a look at how this kind of landscape change applies to southeastern Australia, then what you're finding is that a lot of the temperate grassy woodlands in southeastern Australia fall in this category of fragmented to relictual landscapes. So we have very little of the original native vegetation cover left in this landscape. On aerial photos, it looks something like this. So you find that an area that used to be almost continuous woodland cover is now just sparse tree cover of like, something like 10% of the landscape or something like that is actually covered by woodlands now. A woodland here is defined, this is quite important, is defined, a natural woodland is one where the trees don't necessarily touch in the crowns, but rather there's a bit of space between the crowns of the trees. But we're not dealing with dense forest, but we're also not dealing with these sort of very isolated trees like we see here. That is not natural woodland cover. So natural woodland cover from the air probably looks a bit like what we can see here. So a lot of change in this landscape over the years because of clearing of native vegetation and overgrazing, or let's just say grazing by livestock for commercial purposes. From the side, it looks like this. And often what we're finding is that the vegetation has been severely altered. And some of the larger patches are left, especially on top of hills. Why would that be the case? Well, it's the same pattern as what we see globally. The land that is most suitable for agriculture is the land that is most intensively cleared. That's true at the global scale for biomes, but it's also true at the landscape scale. So on top of hills, your soils are typically more shallow and rockier, and as a result, it's not as suitable for agriculture, and that's often where larger patches of trees have been retained. As you go into the valleys, on the gentle slopes and in the valleys where the soils are a little bit deeper, that's typically where tree clearing has been most pronounced. And we can see that, for example, in this figure here. So in many parts of the landscape, 80 to 95% of land have been cleared, and large patches remain largely on top of hills. So let's take a look at that here. So which proportion of the landscape has no trees? Okay, that's 84%. So that means 84% of the landscape here has no trees. If you take a look at these very small patches, scattered trees or patches smaller than 1 hectare, then that makes up for 4% or 5% of the landscape. So together, you could say 90% of the landscape, that's this and this together, has either no trees or just very small patches. So 90% of the landscape has only very small patches or scattered trees or no trees. And then the other patches, larger patches, 1 hectare, 2 hectare, 3 hectare, 4 hectare, 5 hectares, make up for very small amounts, but then there's also some of these larger patches, bigger than 10 hectares. And those are mostly in yellow areas. Yellow is upland. So most of the large patches, more than 50% of them are on top of hills. So most of the tree cover that's left is basically either very small patches or these large patches on top of hills. That's essentially what the landscape looks like at the moment. These, well, I showed you here that these scattered trees and very small patches actually make up a relatively large amount of what is left in the landscape. So about a third of the remaining tree cover, 15%, right? Almost a third of that occurs as very small patches. Now we know from island biogeography theory that small patches and very small patches are not as valuable per se, but what if they make up most of what's actually left in the landscape? That's what we're dealing with in this landscape here. Most of what is left is actually, or a lot of what is left is actually very small. So there's quite a few of these ones. But if you want to look at lowland vegetation, especially the green stuff, then a lot of that is very small patches. So very small patches and scattered trees is what we're dealing with in this landscape to an extent. Many small patches and scattered trees is what the heading here says, and these have typically been ignored in a conservation context because of this idea that bigger patches are better for biodiversity, which is of course true, but like I said, if most of what you've got left is small or a significant proportion of it, then it also becomes important to think about what's the role of these very small scattered elements throughout the landscape. And interestingly, I would argue that an isolated tree actually is disproportionately important. It fulfills a keystone role, people have sometimes said, relative to an additional tree added to an already large patch. So imagine you're putting a tree in the middle of nowhere. The whole functioning of that place will change quite a lot. Whereas if you add one tree to a patch that's already 10 hectares in size, not very much changes in terms of the ecological functions. So scattered trees fulfill locally extremely important keystone functions because they change a lot of things in the environment. They change water infiltration, they change the nutrients of the soil, they change the hydrology because of this stem flow and water infiltration. That changes, of course, also the salinity of the ground. In terms of plants, the tree per se changes the plant community. Normally you just have grasses and forbs there. It's a seed source for other trees and other shrubs perhaps. Animals might find shelter in such a tree. The hollows of the tree, if they're old, are used by birds and bats and things like that, and maybe some mammals. And underneath you might have fallen timber or litter, which is also used by some animals, for example, invertebrates, but also things like lizards. So locally, a tree makes a big difference. At the landscape level, total amount of tree cover increases if you have scattered trees in the landscape. You have connectivity for tree species. You have connectivity for animals that use these trees as stepping stones as they move through the landscape. And really importantly, you have restoration nuclei for the future. These trees in Australia are often very old. By very old, I mean some of them predate European settlement. So they predate the era when land clearing actually started. That's something quite unique to frontier environments like in Australia. We don't have that in Europe in the same way. So some of these trees are basically older than European land management practices in Australia, which is essentially about 200 years or 250 years. And that means that you have this unique opportunity to also still have the original genetic material prior to intensive human use left in the landscape as potential restoration nuclei for the future. So that also gives us the possibility of using these so-called biological legacies for some continuity through time. When you zoom in, then the situation often looks a little bit like this in the pastures, and that's where things get a bit problematic. What you're finding here is that there are quite a few trees left, but the trees are old. Some of them are quite sick. So you see dead branches here, for example. You see a completely dead tree here. You see some more dead branches up here. So some of them are quite sick and many of them are quite old. So while there are trees left in the landscape at the moment, these trees have sometimes been called the living dead, those that are standing, living and breathing, but as dead as is the litter since they have no reproductive future. They are the living dead. The living dead in the sense that there are no young trees growing here, but it's all old trees. Existing work looked at this in southeastern Australia and found that there was no regeneration in many of the cases where people have basically tried to find young trees. In many cases, there are very few young trees or none at all. So that was the background for our work in Australia, an overcleared region with 85% of native tree cover gone. Much remnant tree cover is in small patches and scattered trees. Historically, those have been ignored in a conservation context because island biogeography tells us that large patches are important and small patches as a result have often been overlooked. And under status quo management, it appears that these trees are not regenerating. We were interested in our work then how severe the problem of tree regeneration failure actually was. We were interested in seeing whether there were any management practices that would help to improve tree regeneration, and we were interested in basically looking at what kinds of management practices might maybe be supported through appropriate policies in order to improve tree regeneration. For that, we had a relatively large project going on for a few years, focusing on a teeny tiny part here of southeastern Australia, but that teeny tiny part still takes multiple hours to drive from the north to the south. So Australia is a big place, basically. We were looking at tree regeneration and biodiversity, also at economic and policy issues and social and cultural issues. I'll talk today only about the tree and biodiversity issues, and a tiny little bit I'll talk about the social aspects in terms of how farmers think about trees. So let's start with part one, all about the trees. Theoretically speaking, tree regeneration is a complex process. You have seedling establishment limited by a whole range of different factors. So you could have limitations to the source, that you just don't have the right seed supply. You would have limitations to the germination of seeds, such that the seeds don't actually start to grow. Or you could have limitation at the level of establishment, where perhaps a tiny seedling manages to start to germinate, but then it maybe gets killed for one reason or another. And there are a number of management actions, both past and present, that influence various of these factors limiting seedling establishment. So for example, if you just don't have parent trees, well, then that's a problem for seed supply. So if you have an overcleared region, actually where are the seeds going to come from? So that's the first problem. Then nutrient inputs have been really problematic in many ways, because if you have very high soil nutrient levels, then in an area that is naturally not used to having high nutrients, then actually the seedlings are outcompeted by introduced grasses and things like that, and they simply don't grow very well. So eucalypts are used to low nutrient environments, which is the native condition of soils in this part of Australia. So linked to the inherent kind of not very suitable to eucalyptus of low soil nutrient levels, and perhaps even more important is competition with pasture species because of high soil nutrients. Livestock grazing can also play a role then, because seedlings once established, for example, might get trampled. Also, livestock grazing might compact the soils and change the soil moisture levels, change the soil nutrient levels, and so on and so forth. So you have lots of seedbed conditions might change. So you have lots of different factors influencing tree regeneration. They mainly relate to how much tree cover do you have left, what nutrients do you put into the ground, and more in this case is not better, but too much doesn't work very well for eucalypts. And you have grazing regimes that are composed of both the stocking rate, which means how many livestock per unit area, and the degree of stock movement. So stock rotation means if livestock is moving around the landscape, that creates a different kind of disturbance regime from if livestock is located in the same place all year round, say. So we looked at those factors, focusing on 33 different farms around southeastern Australia. We surveyed different sites, all measuring 2 hectares. Within those sites, we basically counted trees and measured them. And we also looked at the soil chemistry. We considered open areas with hardly any trees, scattered tree areas, grazed woodland areas, and ungrazed woodland areas. Those were ones that had a fence around them for conservation purposes, where livestock was excluded, essentially a sort of micro land sparing sort of technique. And then for grazing, we considered 3 different kinds of grazing. Basically, so stocking rate aside, so you can have high or low stocking rates, meaning just the total number of livestock. That can be high or low. But then the question is, how do the livestock move around the landscape? So you could have continuous grazing. That's where you essentially have all paddocks stocked, a paddock being a pasture, all paddocks stocked all year round. You might have at the other end what we can call high intensity, short duration grazing. What that is basically, imagine now you're taking all your livestock, and instead of having them spread out equally over the farm, you're shoving them all into one corner, leave them there for 3 days, and then you move them to the next place. And you move them to the next place every 3 days, which means you get very high intensity grazing, but only for, say, 3 days at a time, and then you move them on. That's called rotational grazing. So instead of having low intensity ongoing disturbance for the whole year, you have very short, very intensive disturbance, and then a lot of periods where nothing much is happening at all in terms of disturbance of the grazed land. And you have something in between where people rotate the livestock, but not every 3 days, but maybe every month or 2. So there are some rest periods in that sort of system as well. But in some of these systems, really what you get is very, very, very intense grazing events that are very, very short. So we first of all mapped our farms and chose our farms based on these different grazing regimes. So how many days is a typical paddock grazed per year? So these would be 365 days a year. These are places that never get a real rest from livestock. Livestock's there probably at a low intensity, but it's there all year round. At the other extreme, we have places like this here that are grazed only 10 days a year. So 355 days of the year, there's nothing going on in these paddocks. But then every 3 months, basically, a whole bunch of livestock, cattle typically, sometimes sheep, come in and go and just hit the place really, really hard. And then it gets to recover again for 100 days after that. The actual number of livestock per unit area on the farm, that's measured here, the stocking rate, could be the same between these different regimes. But the difference is that here, livestock are not moving around very much. And here you have short, high-intensity grazing events. We looked at, first of all, how much tree cover occurs at different densities. We looked at what tree diameters we find at different sites. That gives us a sense of the age profile of trees, because basically a really big tree is much, much older than a really small tree. We looked at how long ago was the last regeneration and what's the probability of recent regeneration at any given site. What we're finding is that regional tree cover was 18%. On farms, it was typically more like 12%. And three quarters of tree cover actually occurs, here we can see that, 3/4 of tree cover actually occurs, is less than 30%. So 30% tree cover we can see here, yeah, 30% tree cover is in, is here in, oh, I should be looking up here, landscape cumulative proportion. So 75% of the landscape there, here we go, has 30% tree cover. So 30% of tree cover, so most of the landscape has under 30% tree cover. Knowing then how many trees occur in such a site, we can work out that it's about 3 million trees. And 2/3 have under 10% tree cover, so that's here. So 2/3 of the landscape have this very sparse tree cover, but that's still 1.5 million trees. So it's still a lot of trees that are affected and that occur at these low densities, and it's a huge amount of landscape. So one could say that basically 2/3 of the landscape, or 3/4 of the landscape, have isolated trees in them and no more than that. So it's a huge amount of the landscape that has these isolated trees. In places where trees are scattered or highly isolated, type A and type B site, we have typical diameters of 100 centimeters or 120 centimeters. What that means, a diameter of 100 centimeters typically means over 120 years old for these species of eucalypts. So you're dealing with trees that are over 100 years old. And if you take a look at the shape of this diameter profile, then what you're finding is that there's a lot of trees in this old category, but there's only a small number of trees in these younger categories. Diameter at breast height is what DBH means. So there are relatively fewer here, meaning there is going to be a recruitment shortfall. So a demographic profile like this means you have not enough young trees to replace the current adult trees that we've got here. That's different from what's happening in ungrazed woodland sites. Ungrazed woodland sites where livestock pressure has been excluded. That's where you actually get a large number of very young trees and then increasingly fewer older trees. And that's a natural shape for a forest or for a woodland. That's what you typically get in a natural ecosystem. You get this sort of drop off of diameters. It means that here you have healthy regeneration going on in type D. In type B and A especially, you don't have healthy regeneration going on. Here you have healthy regeneration going on. We also looked at in which kinds of sites we actually found seedlings of trees, meaning things like, small, where do I show? There. Here. Small sorts of trees, seedlings. So where did we find seedlings? And we found that the probability of finding seedlings was substantially higher in grazed woodland sites than it was in scattered tree sites, and that was higher than it was in paddock sites. And it was related to the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So the more nitrogen you have in the soil, your probability of finding regeneration, finding seedlings goes down. And similarly, there was a relationship between the number of parent trees. So if you have more parent trees, the probability of regeneration goes up. And interestingly here, we find there's also an effect of the grazing regime. So if you have no stock rotation or only very slow stock rotation, that's the conventional grazing regime, then what you're finding is low regeneration probabilities. If at the same density of parent trees, you have this rotational grazing with high intensity, short duration grazing, you have a much, much higher probability of getting some regeneration in the site, suggesting that regeneration is significantly and positively related to this either ungrazed conditions or rapid livestock rotation, meaning high intensity, short duration grazing seems to work better for tree regeneration. So what we're finding here is we concluded it's essentially a kind of tree regeneration crisis. You have already overcleared a region, and the conventional practices are that you put on fertilizer and you use continuous livestock grazing, but that basically means you get no regeneration. So if you do that, then millions of hectares of land currently supporting tens of millions of trees across southeastern Australia would be treeless in the future, because there's simply no regeneration over huge areas of land because of this continuous grazing and fertilizer application. Now, what we're finding in that work is that contrary to common wisdom, scattered trees are not doomed to be the living dead, although low seed supply and a history of intensive land use impose constraints on regeneration. Reducing nutrient inputs and applying high intensity, short duration grazing, so fast rotational grazing, can substantially enhance regeneration. And that is the case because you basically have both soil nutrients and livestock grazing being the single most important drivers of the condition of grasslands here. So we won't go through this in detail, but basically if you want to restore a site or look at the ecosystem state here, it's essentially the grazing regime and the nutrient regime. Those together shape what biodiversity you have in any given part of southeastern Australian rangelands or grazing lands. So there are lots of benefits of lower nutrient pastures. There are benefits for tree regeneration. There are also benefits for healthier mature trees. There are more ground cover species typically associated with low nutrient pastures, and there are more arthropod species. Similarly, when it comes to livestock grazing, changing that has ecological benefits, but comes at a potential high economic cost. So, for example, completely removing stock might cost up to 10,000 Australian dollars per year per 100 hectares. So that's a lot of money lost to farmers. On the other hand, this idea of rotational grazing, high intensity, short duration grazing, means you can still use your grazing land, but move your livestock around. And it might promise a win-win outcome in the sense that you can have some farming here, but you can also get some tree regeneration at the same time. So management options then are essentially two. If you think you have a problem with trees in this landscape, there are essentially two things you can do. You can either plant or seed new trees, or you can have sort of passive management where you allow the environmental conditions to be such that trees can naturally recover. Let's take a look at that. When it comes to active management options, then typically what people have done in the past in a restoration context is that they have planted trees in straight rows along existing fence lines. It's commonly done, but it doesn't really do anything for scattered trees. Alternatively, for passive management, something has already been done too, and that is this fencing off woodland patches, so excluding the livestock. That's also commonly done, but again, doesn't really do anything for scattered trees. For scattered trees, there are also options. They would be to establish the trees in a scattered pattern. You could exclude livestock from some paddocks altogether for a few years, put seeds in there, rest them for a few years, and then when the seedlings are high enough, put livestock back in. That's also used in some parts. You could reduce fertilizer use to improve the natural regeneration. And you could, of course, use this rotational grazing that we've talked about on the previous slides. So given these changes here, the next question, of course, is what will happen to biodiversity in terms of wildlife, given these kinds of changes going on? For that, we try to establish links between fauna and tree cover, and we surveyed birds and bats. The bat work is no longer in press, but this is an old presentation, so it's well and truly published. And we're projecting tree cover into the future under different management scenarios. I'll show you the findings of that in just a moment. First of all, let's look at birds. Birds are interesting in the sense that you have this peak density of bird species richness, not at the highest tree densities, but at intermediate tree densities. So if you have intermediate tree densities, you get the most birds, and that's because some species are adapted to basically low or no trees. Some birds are adapted to really high densities of trees, and many can sort of handle this intermediate density, which is typical for woodlands. If we look at this in a multi-dimensional scaling, which is a kind of, it's a multivariate way of looking at data points. I think we looked at that in one of the previous lectures. So here, different sites are indicated. P is a paddock site, and S is a scattered tree site. A GW is a grazed woodland, and a UW is an ungrazed woodland. And what we're finding here is the UWs are sort of all over here, meaning they are close together. If they're close together in multivariate space, this is the bird data, it means they have sort of similar birds. Similarly, the P sites are all together here, meaning they all have sort of similar birds, and so on. If we look at this in a little bit more detail, we find that it looks a bit like that. We have ungrazed woodlands clustering, we have grazed woodlands, scattered tree sites, paddock sites, and the revegetation sites, in fact, also clustered a little bit in one particular location. And different kinds of bird species in turn are associated with these sites. So if you're in an open paddock, you find typically these bird species. If you're in an ungrazed woodland, you're typically finding these kinds of species. If you're in a grazed woodland, these are common species. If you're in a scattered tree site, then these are common species. So different species of birds seem to specialize on different environments along this gradient of tree densities. Different individual birds, therefore, have a different probability of occurrence along this tree density continuum. Occurrence is spelled wrong, sorry about that. This was not the published version. So for example, as the tree density increases, the rufous whistler, one bird species, increases. It increases in terms of probability of occurrence. Very likely that it occurs in places that have high tree densities. On the other hand, Richard's pipit is a grassland species, and it declines as you get more and more trees. You're most likely to find this in places with 0 trees. And then some of the parrot species, the eastern rosella, the crimson rosella, as examples, these are 2 of the parrot species. They peak at intermediate levels of tree density. So that's how different species respond in different ways. And what we're finding is that it's sort of not random which birds occur where, but rather you have increasingly smaller birds at the denser sites. So that's the bird weight per site. So in grams, the smaller birds occur in the denser sites. And that's related to a thing called the landscape texture hypothesis. So basically, if you have a finely textured environment, then small organisms will use that. If you have a very coarse environment, then larger animals will use that. That makes a lot of sense. And also the types of diets change as the tree density changes. So as you're moving into the denser sites, you have more arboreal species, arboreal insectivores especially, that's them here. They make up a larger proportion of the bird composition in densely treed areas, whereas in sparsely treed areas you have a lot of G, that's granivores, for example, or GI, ground insectivores. So they together make up a large proportion in the areas with very few trees. So you have a shift in what kinds of birds you're getting across this continuum of trees. We also looked at bats. For that, we set up recorders that take that basically record the sort of the calls, the echolocation calls of bats in order to move around the landscape. Bats emit these echolocation calls so they don't crash into stuff. And we set up these recorders that were left to record the different bat calls. And different species of bats, that's someone's finger, meaning this is not a very large animal. Different species of bats have different echolocation calls. So this is the call profile through time in kilohertz. And you see that Gould's wattle bat, for example, has this sort of call profile. Whereas the little forest bat here has a different call profile. Yeah? So you can see it's that the software later can analyze the calls that were recorded overnight, not very large animals, that were recorded overnight, and you can basically detect the difference there. You can automate that to an extent, and that's how you get species lists for different places in the environment. What we're finding then is that just like with the birds, different bat species respond in different ways to gradients of tree density. So you have species that peak at intermediate levels of density, like these ones. You have species that increase with denser tree cover, and you have species that prefer the relatively more open environments. So each of these is a different bat species that you can see here, that there are different responses to tree density in this environment. And what's happening is that if we ask the same question as for birds and we ask, well, what kinds of bats is it? Is it all the same bats? No, it's not. You have denser tree cover going this way on this particular picture, and the number of calls is shown by the bigger circles. So that's where you have, in denser tree cover, you have these kinds of bats mostly. That's these ones, that's abbreviations for bat species. Whereas in more open tree cover, you have these kinds of bats here. This one and this one's at intermediate tree cover. And the other way of this gradient, we have bigger and faster flying bats. So what's happening is that the wing morphology and the size of bats plays a major role. Basically, if you have short wings and you fly, you're very mobile and you can maneuver very easily. And that's when you occur in denser tree cover. That's these kinds of species here. Whereas if you're out in the open, where you need to fly fast between places, need to get a long way, there's not a lot to move around because it's open. That's where you have longer, straighter wings, and you have bigger and faster flying bats in those kinds of environments. So what will happen now with tree decline to birds and bats? And before we get into that, I show you a small animation of what will happen to tree cover given the modeling work that we did. So we looked here 100 years into the future. This is based on remote sensing data. Current tree cover looks like that. And we created a demographic model of tree regeneration based on what we knew about the diameters of trees. And we looked at that through time. So 100 years into the future, let's just play this again. 100 years into the future, there will be a lot less tree cover than right now because we have so many mature trees, but not enough regeneration under status quo management in much of the landscape. Of course, people don't think 100 years ahead, but that's essentially what we're proposing where the landscape is heading over the next 100 years. Whoops. Okay, so what it means is if you are 100 years into the future, on the x-axis here we have up to 192 years, doesn't really matter. You're finding that the part of the landscape with less than one tree, that's the white part, per 2 hectares, as opposed to the part with, say, under 25 trees and whatever, that treeless area is growing, and the number of trees in different parts is declining. So you have declines in trees in all the different classes. Over the next 100 years, then, we expect that woodland species would decline, scattered tree, the bird species that need woodland vegetation, denser woodland, would decline by 40%. We're expecting that the bird species that use scattered trees will decline by something like 30%. We're expecting that those bird species using open areas, meaning areas without trees, they will increase, but that's not very many species. They will increase substantially, but it's very few species. The woodland bat species, same thing, they will decline, and the scatter tree bat species also will decline based on their associations with those environments, which in turn are changing through time. We can see that here. So for example, tree density is predicted in this particular farm to change like that. The dark green is the most densely treed area. So trees are going to be thinner and thinner. As that happens, a grassland species like Richard's pipit finds increasingly larger areas of suitable habitat. The eastern rosella likes scattered tree environments, and it therefore will decline a bit, but not very much. And the noisy firebird also likes densely treed environments, relatively densely treed environments, and it's not changing as much in this particular scenario. So we have basically, depending on what sort of environment you need, what sort of tree density you're responding to, the environment will change for you. There will be some species that will win, but that is relatively few species. Many species fall in these categories, like the eastern rosella and noisy firebird, and will decline through time. So that's kind of a very short summary of the tree regeneration and biodiversity component, but we can also look at some of the social components. So what do farmers think about all this? And for that, farmers were asked to take pictures with disposable cameras and were asked to take pictures of things that were significant to them. And then people were interviewed about this in a process called photo elicitation, and farmers often talk very passionately about their trees. So for example, this particular farmer said, I just love this tree. It's just scraggly, but it's just a beauty. It's just such a good shade tree. You can see a family of animals of whatever sort just under there, and they could spend a hot day sitting under there chatting away to one another. You've actually got to walk to it because it's up on the edge of a slope, but it just lightens my heart when I see it. So these are not very sensitive new age guy type people, these Australian farmers. But when talking about their favorite trees, sometimes they got quite emotional. Many of the things that people took photos of were about woody vegetation, and many farmers were somewhat attached to trees. So they were attached to woody vegetation according to their photo choices, much more so than to, say, homesteads or animals or soils or whatever. Most of the trees photos taken of significant features on their farms were actually of trees. And mostly people took pictures actually of isolated paddock trees, so disproportionately so. Also, sparse trees often show up in these, in a sort of, if you do a GIS analysis of particular pictures and you look at, well, what actually is in this picture, and you take a look at that picture is taken from here. The yellow bits is what can be seen within that picture. So you can do that in a GIS if you consider this elevation of the terrain. And so the yellow bits is what you can see in the landscape. And if you then analyze that, then it contains a lot of paddock trees. So disproportionately, people took photos of isolated trees. So isolated trees are declining massively, but they also seem to be particularly preferred as by farmers in terms of their choice of what they take photos of when asked to take photos of significant features on their farms. So more than twice as much as expected by chance, people took photos of scattered trees. An interesting finding. When we look at this into sort of narratives, then you get a similar story there. Basically, farmers talk about the beauty and the biodiversity, and they talk about that they're declining, they're unhealthy, they're aging when it comes to sparse trees. When it comes to patches of trees, which they also took photos of, they talk about those patches are nicely regenerating. So that's the big difference, is that basically a lot of this is protected, a lot of it's regenerating, but a lot of the talk is actually about these declining sparse trees, which are considered beautiful and important for biodiversity, but are also declining, aging, and largely not protected at present. So with those trends, trees will be lost unless urgent action is taken, but there's an opportunity in the sense that graziers seem to value their trees. Rotational grazing seems to be increasingly popular, and it does seem that some farms are actually viable without chemical use as well, which is helping the soil nutrient status. So it seems that what's needed is both altered grazing regimes and nutrient management. at large scales. That's a summary of some of the work that we did quite some time back in Australia, but that I hope brings together several of the components when we think about biodiversity decline. We were able to look at how different kinds of species respond to the environment in different ways, how we have challenges with the old paradigms of conservation about large patches, when really sometimes it's the very small features in the environment that matter. We see how livestock grazing, a globally widespread human land use, is such a major force of landscape change, and all of that hopefully in an interesting case study in Australia. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.